The psychological chessboard had a beginning, a dark, bleeding origin point that began 2 long years ago. The heavy power saw in her hand felt entirely useless, its weight dead and cold as she froze in absolute terror. Out there in the suffocating blackness of the mountain, a pair of piercing blue eyes glowed like an apex predator catching a scent. Her feet were rooted deep into the muddy earth, paralyzed by the sheer, cold bloodlust of the silhouette before her, a man calmly burying another human being alive. The word murderer looped in her mind like a deafening siren. A concept she had only ever consumed in sterile news headlines was now breathing the same damp air. Cold sweat broke across her skin, a sudden, violent contrast to the wholly ordinary, uneventful day she had just crawled through. She had spent her afternoon auditing overdue bills, treating diseased bark, and arguing with a non-paying client. Just normal, human friction. It was an old, solitary habit for the tree doctor, saw Lee-yeon, to climb into the neglected mountain trails at night to tend to the forgotten flora. This untamed private property always felt like a theater of ghosts, its starved, malnourished trees twisted into grotesque shapes. She loved them precisely because they were broken. Help! Please! God, help me! A muffled, desperate scream broke through the trees, only to be abruptly choked off as a heavy shovel of earth slammed down upon the face, leaving nothing but a thick, agonizing silence. The towering stranger wore a slick, black plastic raincoat that shimmered under the pale moonlight. He shoveled the soil with a rhythmic, terrifyingly familiar precision. This wasn't his first grave. It was a routine. Please. I will tell you everything. A pathetic voice begged from the dirt, a single, blooded arm protruding from the fresh earth, scratching frantically at the mud for a handhold. Unlike the dying soul struggling against the weight of the world, the monster simply hummed a casual, lilting tune. Wrong. He murmured, his voice smooth and detached. At this point, you should be begging me to end it quickly. The silence stretched, tight and heavy. The show has only just begun. The stranger whispered, brought his heavy boot down onto the scratching fingers, and began to repeatedly, maniacally smash them into the rocks. A sickening crunch, followed by a pitiful, muffled shriek from beneath the earth. The man's face remained stony, a white, sleek visage that resembled the pale bark of a midnight birch tree. He possessed no human warmth, no living complexion. He merely tilted his head, watching his own monstrous reflection dance along the edge of his steel blade. Don't you understand? The more you scream, the more excited I get. He whispered, pressing his boot down onto the victim's exposed head like a man snuffing out a spent cigarette. I simply cannot stop doing this, because a fool like you crawls out of the woodwork every single time. As the frantic movements beneath the soil gradually weakened, and then stopped completely, the cold, undeniable truth settled in Lee-yeon's gut. An execution. Right in front of me. Her hands trembled violently, slick with nervous sweat. Keeping her eyes locked on the raincoat, she slipped her phone behind her back, her fingers fumbling blindly against the glass to dial emergency services. Every ounce of her focus was poured into her fingertips. And that was her mistake. A single, sharp snap of a stray branch echoed through the dead silence. In the normal world, it was nothing. In the dead of night, it was a gunshot. The shoveling stopped instantly. The man dropped the tool, and Lee-yeon's gaze followed it down, only now registering the heavy, metallic stench of blood pooling around the fresh grave. The victim's white shirt was entirely drenched in a dark, expanding stain. "What the fuck is this?" a voice purred, right beside her ear. "Isn't it about time you started running for your life?" A deafening crack, a bullet tore through the bark. Lee-yeon ran. The muddy terrain swallowed her shoes, the damp earth squelching loudly with every frantic step. It was a clumsy, terrifying sprint, but hesitation meant a shallow grave. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs, her lungs burning for oxygen. The line finally clicked open. What young police station? Hello. She sobbed, her voice fracturing into 1,000 pieces. Someone is burying a body. Please, come quickly. He saw me. I am going to die. Calm down. Can you give us a location? Yes, the grove of Japanese oaks. I just passed the old elm with the large hollow. Please. Is there a landmark, a building nearby? Lee-yeon gasped for air, forcing her fracturing mind to hold together. Spruce Tree Hospital. The mountain right behind the clinic. Units are moving. Be warned that prank calls carry severe consequences. Just come, please. She finally burst through the tree line, hitting the asphalt of the main road. She paused for a single, breathless second, believing she was safe. A wire, thin as a literal thread, wrapped violently around her throat and yanked her backward into the dark. She clawed frantically at her neck, but the wire was a razor, slicing deep into her skin. "Hey!" A terrifyingly soft whisper brushed against her ear, the warm, steady breathing sending a violent shudder down her spine. "You dropped this." One hand tightened the garrote, while his other hand casually, mockingly placed something heavy back into her palm. It was her power tool. Before the darkness could swallow her consciousness, fueled by pure, animal survival, Lee-yeon swung the heavy metal backward with everything she had left. A sickening, dull crunch echoed as the heavy saw collided violently with the side of the man's skull. She didn't look back to see the damage. She swung blindly, twice more, until the wire suddenly slackened around her bleeding neck. She stumbled forward into the night, petrified, never looking back as the power saw belatedly roared to life in her hand, screaming into the empty mountain. She had no idea that the monster she had just broken, the secret patient who would soon be delivered to her clinic, would spend the next 2 years lying in her bed, unmoving, silent, a vegetative beast waiting for her touch to wake him. Imagine looking at a magnificent, ancient tree, the supposed pride of a schoolyard, and telling the principal, it has constipation. That is exactly how Lee-yeon started her morning. The principal's mouth fell open, a perfect picture of modern, bureaucratic disbelief. To him, trees were just green background noise, expensive decor meant to look pretty for the inspection boards. But to Lee-yeon, the gentle caress of her fingers against the coarse, drying bark told a far more intimate story. The tree was choking, suffocating from the inside out, unable to release what it didn't need to grow. And as she calmly explained that a tree's internal waste management is just as vital as a human's, the principal simply smirked behind a fake cough. In his mind, this skinny woman with soil trapped beneath her fingernails and the sharp scent of fertilizer clinging to her worn trousers was just an eccentric, unappealing fool from a failing business. But what he didn't realize was that he was walking straight into a trap of his own making. You see, the principal had a little secret. He had hired Lee-yeon's small, struggling practice instead of a high-end city hospital because he wanted someone cheap, someone he could easily blame when the tree inevitably died. His plan was to sue her for a refund, pocket the cash, and cut the grand symbol of the school down anyway. It's always the ones who talk loudest about preservation who are the quickest to bury the evidence. Lee-yeon tilted her head, her clear, sun-warmed face smudged with dirt, her hair tied back like drooping seaweed. To a man obsessed with polished, corporate aesthetics, she looked utterly disposable. But beneath that unrefined exterior, her eyes held the cold, calculating sharpness of a true predator. Slowly, she began to circle him. She noted the way the dying branches started from the very top, a classic symptom of root rot. She asked him about the recent school remodeling. She casually dropped words like tiles, leftover cement, plastic bags. With every word, the psychological tension tightened like a noose around the principal's neck. His shoulders flinched. Cold sweat broke across his forehead as he avoided her gaze. He had buried the construction waste directly beneath the roots to save a few bucks on disposal fees, thinking the earth would keep his secrets. He didn't count on a doctor who could read the soil like an autopsy report. When those toxic materials mix with water, they harden into subterranean suffocators. Once they started digging, the truth would be bare for everyone to see. Pulling a flower-patterned handkerchief from her neck, Lee-yeon wiped her brow and offered a sweet, innocent smile, a smile that absolutely failed to reach her icy eyes. She told him the entire ground needed to be replaced, and that she'd be sending over the hefty estimate later that day. Oh, and before she forgot, she would also be reporting the illegal dumping to the city hall. The principal panicked, stammering and begging for a compromise, but the tables had completely turned. The greed that made him happy to save a few dollars was now going to cost him triple the amount in fines. Lee-yeon turned on her heel, a dark satisfaction settling in her chest. She hated playing political games, but her beloved Spruce Tree Hospital tucked away on the beautiful emerald-ringed island of Hwaido, desperately needed the upgrade. If she had to play the ruthless executioner to protect her silent, green patients, so be it. She was excellent at saving trees, but even better at weeding out the human parasites that ruined them. As she left, she forced one last, drippingly sweet recommendation, telling him to visit her hospital more often. Driving her scooter down the coastal road, the breathtaking Korean sea stretching out like a vast sheet of silk beside her, Lee-yeon let out a long sigh. At over 30 years old, she was entirely used to the way the world looked down on her. Men like the principal treated her like a wild animal, a cut-rate female laborer they could exploit because she lacked a shiny city office. They wore suits, but they were the ones who would burn down a forest just to use a leaf as an ashtray. Her phone buzzed in her ear, breaking the soothing hum of the ocean breeze. "Hey, Director!" Her lone staff member's voice chimed through the earpiece, frantic and breathless. "If you don't get back here within 5 minutes, I'm unlocking the second floor." The peaceful emerald coastline of Hwaido fractured in an instant, the tires of Lee-yeon's scooter slicing sharply across the asphalt as her heart slammed against her ribs. The serene landscape blurred into an anxious streak of green. Through her earpiece, the frantic voice of her 60-year-old manager, Lee-yeon, shattered the morning calm. A sound had come from the locked upper floor. An impossible sound, from a room that was supposed to be completely empty. Lee-yeon desperately tried to spin a web of fragile excuses, throwing out frantic lies about cracking foundations and drying crops, but the older woman wasn't buying it. Chu-ja was a stubborn, no-nonsense arborist, and her curiosity had finally reached a boiling point. She had already called a locksmith. The wooden sign of the Spruce Tree Hospital was still swinging precariously when Lee-yeon abandoned her scooter, bursting through the door and sprinting up the stairs with her lungs on fire. She reached the landing just as the locksmith was leaning over the handle. Forced to adopt the same sharp, warning tone she usually reserved for the corrupt contractors who tried to cheat her business, Lee-yeon managed to weave a half-truth about a mysterious property owner to push them back. It was a tense, psychological standoff, a battle of wills that only ended when Chu-ja finally retreated downstairs, leaving a bitter promise that she wasn't giving up. Sliding down the locked door, Lee-yeon collapsed onto the floor, waiting for the adrenaline to slowly drain from her veins. This damned second floor was a ticking time bomb. Turning the key, she stepped inside, leaving the warmth of the island behind to enter a clinical, suffocating reality. The grey, urban room was cold, filled with the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of medical monitors keeping a ghost tethered to the living world. On the bed lay a man. It was impossible to tell his age anymore. 2 years of static confinement had thinned his limbs and shrunk his massive frame, yet his wide, angular shoulders remained exactly as they were on the terrifying night she first encountered him in the mountains. Sitting beside him, Lee-yeon let out a heavy sigh, the exhaustion of her secret life weighing down on her skin. She was a doctor of the earth, trained to read the root systems of ancient trees, not the fragile, failing anatomy of a human being. Especially this human being. Even now, the memory played in her mind like a horrific loop of film. She remembered the deafening roar of her power saw, the weight of the heavy tool swinging through the dark air to protect her own life. She had nicked him, leaving blood on the tip of the blade, but he hadn't even flinched. He had just stared at her with a lethal, predatory intensity that assured her she was about to take her last breath. But then came a sudden, chaotic fracture in the horror. A heavy stone had collided with the back of his skull. His jaw clenched in agonizing pain before his massive body fell to the dirt with a hollow thud. Standing behind him was his bruised, blood-slicked attacker, a man who would have been buried alive in those woods if Lee-yeon hadn't intervened. That savior had staggered, eyes unfocused, before collapsing and rolling down the dark hill into the night, leaving Lee-yeon entirely alone with the body. Now, in the sterile silence of the hidden room, she looked down at the pale face of her captive stranger. Kwon Chae-woo. The name still felt awkward and heavy on her tongue. Pressing her fingers to her throbbing temples, she let out a desperate, whispered plea into the empty room. Ever since she ran away from home, all she had ever yearned for was a boring, ordinary, invisible life among the trees. She looked at the man who held the key to her absolute destruction, and silently begged him never to wake up. Exhausted, Lee-yeon buried her face in her hands, letting the darkness take over for just a moment, completely unaware that beneath the thin white sheets, the man's finger had just slightly twitched. The next morning, the financial reality of running a sinking business crashed down harder than the island waves. Sitting at her desk, Lee-yeon was deep in her treatment diary when Chu-ja approached, a rare, ambitious sparkle dancing in her eyes as she thrust her phone forward. On the screen was the face of a wealthy young man, the heir to Soleil Landscaping, a corporate giant known for sweeping up every massive project in the region. Lee-yeon offered a flat, dismissive glance before returning to her paperwork, joking that the boy looked young enough to be Chu-ja's grandson. But Chu-ja wasn't playing. Her voice dropped, heavy with a sadness that made Lee-yeon's jaw clench in familiar frustration. The truth was, Spruce Tree Hospital was suffocating. A massive, corporate predator, D University's 5-story corporate clinic, had aggressively moved into Hwaido. They wined and dined the local developers, monopolized the major contracts, and left Lee-yeon scraping by on cheap town hall inspections. They were drowning, and they both knew it. When Lee-yeon bitterly asked if they should just shut down and go work for the enemy, Chu-ja snickered, reminding her of the time Lee-yeon had literally thrown manure at a rival construction crane during an environmental protest. They weren't corporate sellouts. They were fighters. And that was when Chu-ja revealed her wildly inappropriate, brilliant master plan. The Soleil heir was currently in Korea on a string of arranged blind dates. Chu-ja didn't want Lee-yeon to marry the man. She just wanted her to crash the date, have tea, and seductively steal the landscaping contracts back. Lee-yeon recoiled, horrified at the thought of acting like a gold digger. But Chu-ja, the epitome of a glamorous, high-heeled 60-year-old, refused to back down. In a rare moment of fierce authority, she cornered Lee-yeon. Romance was dead anyway, she argued. This was about survival. It was a calculated career move to save their livelihood. Helpless against the logic of a bleeding bank account, Lee-yeon found herself nodding. She would do it for the hospital. But as Chu-ja began handing over a hotel room key, a sudden realization hit Lee-yeon. How did an island arborist get the president of a multi-million-dollar corporation's private schedule? Chu-ja simply arched a perfectly manicured eyebrow and smiled smugly. She used to date the president. Lee-yeon nearly choked. Chu-ja's colorful, chaotic love life had always felt like a dark fairy tale to her. Chu-ja had taken Lee-yeon in when she was just a traumatized, 17-year-old runaway with no concept of affection. For 15 years, the free-spirited older woman had tried to teach her that life was too short to eat stale bread and hide from intimacy. But Lee-yeon had stubbornly remained fiercely conservative, burying herself only in the safe, quiet world of trees. As Chu-ja launched into another grand, dramatic monologue about seizing destiny and avoiding a lonely life, Lee-yeon did what she always did when human emotions got too loud. She slipped out the door and ran. But as she stepped into the crisp island air, Chu-ja's final, echoing shout followed her down the path, a sharp, lingering question that cut through the psychological armor she had built around herself for years. Are you going to be alone your entire life? The grandfather clock in the lower hallway chimed exactly 12 times, a loud, heavy toll that echoed through the dark, vacant spaces of the hospital. Outside, a silver sliver of moonlight cut through the window, throwing elongated shadows across the steps. A dark silhouette ascended the staircase in absolute silence, the old wood giving away nothing but a few faint, rhythmless creaks. Visiting the second floor at midnight had become Lee-yeon's sacred, unholy routine. Originally, she had intended to look just once. But over the last 2 years, that sterile room had transformed into a psychological anchor. To her, seeing that dangerous man locked in a helpless, vegetative state was the only true guarantee of her safety. As long as he remained a ghost tethered to a mattress, she was free. She had always believed that plants possess a spirit. That word shaped their reality. Praise them, and they bloom. Curse them, and they wither into dust. Standing before the keypad, she punched in the code, letting the mechanism click open as she chanted a desperate, silent prayer into the dark. Please, don't wake up. Just let me have a quiet, boring life. She pushed the door wide, expecting the comforting, predictable sight of a frail, unmoving shell. Instead, she froze. The bed was empty. Lee-yeon blinked once, twice, 3 times, her mind flatly refusing to process the stark white, unwrinkled sheets. The medical monitors beeped aimlessly into the void, tracking nothing but thin air. A violent chill surged down her spine, raising goosebumps across her flesh as the sudden, suffocating realization hit her. He was gone, and she was no longer safe. In an instant, the fragile piece of the island dissolved, and her mind violently recoiled back into the dark flashback of the night her world ended. 2 years ago, standing alone in the mountain shadows, she had stared down at a pool of thick, spreading crimson. She had been so certain that the massive stranger was dead, that rolling down a jagged hill with a fractured skull meant an absolute end. Trembling, her legs nearly giving out beneath her, she had willed herself to take one agonizing step toward escape. She had promised herself that she would find the police, endure the nightmares, and somehow survive. She was celebrating that tiny victory of survival when the darkness caught her from behind. A heavy, rough cloth slammed over her face, reeking of a bitter, chemical sting. She fought, thrashing against the unseen weight, but the toxic fumes flooded her lungs, and her consciousness fractured into blackness. When she finally awoke, her skull was pounding to the rhythm of a failing, flickering light bulb. The air was dense, thick with a nauseating, metallic scent and the heavy, sweet smoke of a cigar. Lee-yeon tried to pull away, but the cold bite of steel dug deep into her wrists. She was bound tightly to a metal chair. Through the haze, the silhouette of a man in an impeccably tailored suit emerged from the shadows. "Who are you?" she had whispered, her throat dry, her courage nearly depleted. The man didn't answer immediately. He took a slow, deliberate drag of his cigar, his face obscured by the pulsing shadow of the light bulb. "Why did you do that?" His voice finally drifted through the smoke, flat, emotionless, and entirely devoid of human empathy. "I don't think he'll live with his head smashed like that." Lee-yeon remained paralyzed in silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The half-dead guy." The man continued, the light bulb suddenly stabilizing to reveal his cold, aristocratic features. "He's my brother." As her eyes fully adjusted to the dimness, the true horror of her surroundings unfolded. This wasn't an ordinary room. Giant, rusted iron hooks hung from the concrete ceiling, supporting the massive, pale carcasses of slaughtered pigs. The rhythmic, steady drip of animal blood onto the concrete floor made her stomach violent churn. All around her, workers in heavy rubber boots walked casually through the red slush, completely indifferent to her presence. They extracted intestines, carved flesh, and washed away the evidence with long, high-pressure water hoses. She was sitting in a functional slaughterhouse. The man in the suit blew a thin stream of grey smoke into her face. "While you were sleeping," he said softly, a dark, terrifying amusement behind his words, "I pondered whether I should simply tear you apart piece by piece, or just throw you straight into the sea." Suddenly, a series of violent, desperate bangs erupted from a metal oil drum at the far end of the room. A muffled, frantic scream echoed from inside the sealed container, a terrifying reminder of what happened to people who crossed this family. "My brother is dying," the man whispered, stepping closer as the psychological tension reached a breaking point. "And someone has to pay the price." Desperation is a fragile shield when facing a monster. Tears tracked through the grime on Lee-yeon's cheeks as she begged the man in the tailored suit to understand. She hadn't swung the rock, she had only brandished her saw in self-defense. It was the other man, the one his brother had been trying to bury alive, who delivered the crushing blow. But the man in the silver-rimmed glasses merely flicked his cigar ash, utterly untroubled by his brother's murderous habits. To him, the interruption was the only real crime. Looking at his smooth, unwrinkled face, Lee-yeon realized there was absolutely no warmth behind those lenses. He flatly refused to believe a helpless victim could ambush his highly capable brother from behind. Without evidence, without witnesses, Lee-yeon's life was slipping through her fingers like water. And the entire time, the rhythmic, frantic banging from the metal drum across the room served as a horrific soundtrack to her interrogation. Then came the true horror of his logic. To a man of his standing, facts were entirely irrelevant. He didn't care who actually swung the stone. He simply needed a scapegoat to bleed for his brother's newly diagnosed coma. Dropping to her eye level, his breath laced with cigar smoke, he offered her a sickening alternative to the metal drum. A deal. A chance to leave the slaughterhouse alive. She was to play the role of a warden. She would take his comatose brother back to her isolated island, nurse him, and keep him hidden. And in return, she would become the hound tasked with tracking down the true attacker. If she let the body leave Hwaido, her life would be forfeit. The heavy shackles were unlocked, a contract was signed, and the metallic scraping of the oil drum being dragged away signaled the end of her nightmare. Until now. The flashback shattered, dropping Lee-yeon violently back into the present. The moonlight still painted the empty bed in stark, ghostly white. The forgotten terror of that slaughterhouse rushed back into her lungs, thick and suffocating. If the man in the suit found out his brother was missing, she wouldn't just lose her hospital, she would lose her life. Panic tightening its grip on her chest, she spun around to search the shadows. But the predator was already waiting. A heavy, dark silhouette erupted from behind the door, slamming into her with sudden, brutal force. A medical monitor crashed to the floor with a deafening bang as they went down. 2 years of muscle atrophy should have rendered him helpless, but the raw, instinctual strength left in his frame was terrifying. He twisted her arms brutally behind her back, pinning her face down into the mattress. His large, heavy body pressed flush against her thin pajamas, a sudden, intimate, and deeply terrifying weight that completely sealed her escape. The ghost hadn't just vacated the bed. He was awake, and he had already caught his first prey. Pinned beneath him. Lee-yeon felt her chest tightening to the point of suffocation. She wanted nothing more than for the cold concrete floor to open up and swallow her whole. But survival requires a voice, even a trembling one. Kwon Chae-woo. Kwon Chae-woo. She whispered into the dark, her hands blindly reaching for her phone. She desperately needed to summon the private medical keeper hiding downstairs, the one hired by Chae-woo's terrifying brother to handle the intimate, daily maintenance of a living ghost. Lee-yeon's only job was to act as the warden, to keep this dangerous soul anchored to the island until the real culprit was found. She knew absolutely nothing about the man pinning her down, except that his family possessed the kind of quiet, absolute wealth that could build a secret medical wing overnight. They were the kind of people who could reshape reality with a single phone call. "It's not difficult for me to make you a murderer." The brother's parting threat echoed in her mind, chilling her to the bone. She had tried to fight back once. 2 years ago, she ran to the police, but the mounting crime scene had already been scrubbed clean. The authorities treated her like a lunatic. And when she tried a second time, her phone buzzed with a text from the brother, containing a casual photograph of himself smiling next to the police chief. The game was rigged from the start. She had learned the hard way never to bark at predators who own the cages. So, she had surrendered to her fate, praying every night that Chae-woo would simply remain a sleeping shell. But the nightmare was awake, and his heavy, suffocating presence was entirely real. "I know you're confused," she choked out, trying to sound authoritative despite the raw panic in her veins. "Let me go, and I will explain everything." Instead of releasing her, his heavy frame shifted, sinking deeper into her space. The shadow of his massive form blocked out the silver moonlight. Slowly, deliberately, the tip of his nose brushed against the sensitive skin of her nape. A gasp caught in her throat as he inhaled her scent, slow and predatory, like a wild animal mapping out its territory. His hot, uneven breath sent a violent shiver down her spine. "Stop making a fuss." His voice cut through the dark, rough, gravelly, and entirely unfamiliar. "Answer my questions." Lee-yeon gave a sharp, frantic nod, her cheek pressed hard against the mattress. "Did you lock me up?" The question threw her completely off balance. The tone was shockingly calm, almost polite. "What?" she breathed. "Or?" he murmured, his voice shifting into an eerie, almost childlike innocence that felt utterly mismatched with his massive, dangerous body. "Did I lock you up?" The sheer absurdity of the question momentarily cracked through her terror. "Absolutely not," she snapped. "What kind of person do you think I am?" "I am the one asking questions here," he growled softly, a sweet, terrifying contrast to his physical dominance. "Why am I here?" He was demanding a reality, and she had to construct one fast to save her own life. "You're a patient," she whispered, trying to soothe the beast. "You just woke up from a very long sleep. You aren't in danger. I promise. Please, calm down." Slowly, the erratic heaving of his chest began to stabilize. Her words were working, anchoring his fractured mind. But a deep, psychological dread settled in her gut. A conscious murderer was infinitely more dangerous than a sleeping one. How long could she hide his true, cruel nature from the rest of the world? How long before he remembered who he was? "Then why are you trembling?" His hoarse voice scratched against her ear, pulling her back to the immediate danger. A faint, dark amusement seemed to dance across his features. "Did you do something wrong to me?" Before she could even process the audacity of his question, the crushing weight vanished. In one swift, effortless motion, He gripped her waist and flipped her over like a fried egg, leaving her staring directly up into the abyss of his dark eyes. He leaned down, bringing his face dangerously, intoxicatingly close to hers. Staring up at him, the proximity was suffocating. Through the heavy tension, Lee-yeon's eyes mapped the sharp ridge of his nose, the wild, unkempt strands of hair brushing his neck, and his irises, a light, pale wood color that flickered like a dying flame. 2 years of confinement had thinned his frame, but the thick, brutal skeletal structure beneath his shabby hospital clothes remained entirely intact. Those pale eyes were polished, yet hollow, like looking down into an empty pit. The air grew freezing as he instinctively pinned her down further. Sweat pooled at her collarbone. A man like this would never forget the face of the woman who held the power saw that night in the mountains. He was staring at his last memory, and she was staring at her executioner. "You look familiar," he murmured, his face completely blank, as if his mind had been violently hollowed out. When she couldn't find her voice, a dark, mocking smirk twisted his lips. "Kwon Chae-woo. Kwon Chae-woo," he whispered, mimicking the exact, frantic tone she had used moments before. "That would most likely be my name." Then, the amusement vanished, replaced by an eerie, cold seriousness. "Are you important to me? Or are you someone I can just kill?" Lee-yeon's gaze dropped. In his hand, he was holding a stray medical needle, clicking it repeatedly, rhythmically, like a ballpoint pen. He casually drove the sharp point into his own thumb, watching the dark, crimson drops bead and spill over his skin. He didn't even flinch. He was assessing her the way a butcher assesses meat, and the raw terror finally broke her silence. "Don't say that. I am very important to you," she gasped, her lungs desperate for air. "Don't you remember me? We are close. We've been intertwined for longer than you think." She was spinning a frantic tapestry of lies, anchoring him to the forced contract she had signed with his brother. They were bound, a toxic knot that neither of them could easily untie. Suddenly, his large hand clamped around her face. He squeezed her cheeks with such raw, uncalibrated power that her jaw felt on the verge of splintering. The physical agony made her eyes water as the veins on the back of his hand bulged with terrifying strength. "You say you're important, so why are you trembling?" he growled, his vocabulary suddenly turning sharp, vulgar, and deeply unsettling. "Were you sold to this place to satisfy a vegetable who couldn't even think?" Lee-yeon's cheek twitched, horrified by the sudden venom pouring from his lips. Chae-woo paused, rubbing his own temple in deep, aggressive confusion. Why can I only remember such trashy words?" The psychological whiplash was dizzying. She knew absolutely nothing about this man. No age, no past, no history, only the shadow of a monster. But as a doctor of the earth, she understood survival. Trees adapt to the harshest storms. A locust tree grows flat against the earth when it collapses. A maple bends with a violent wind. This wasn't a medical emergency anymore. This was a war. Clenching her teeth against the blinding pain in her facial bones, she grabbed his heavy wrist. "Kwon Chae-woo." He blinked, slowly releasing his grip. His light eyes widened slightly as he stared at the angry, dark red handprints staining the pale skin of her cheeks. "We are not in that kind of relationship," she rushed out, her voice cracking as her fingers instinctively shielded her throat. "We got along beautifully. You were incredibly kind to me. You even gave me a necklace." She lied smoothly, desperate to rewrite his blank slate into something gentle. But Chae-woo merely tilted his head, his expression flattening into a dark, carnal cynicism. "So, did I treat you like an animal?" he asked bluntly, his voice devoid of any romance. "Because you speak like someone who has been completely brainwashed." "No," she protested, screaming internally against the weight of his psychological trap. The silence stretched, heavy, sensual, and terrifyingly volatile. She was trying to brainwash a predator, but looking into those hollow, wood-colored eyes, she realized the beast might already be reading right through her. The desperate web of lies she was weaving wasn't just to pacify the beast. It was a reflection of her own deepest desires for survival. "You just couldn't do anything bad to me," she murmured into the dark, her voice a fragile shield. Chae-woo merely tilted his head, his prominent brows shifting in silent, absolute skepticism. Her words were falling on entirely deaf ears. He didn't buy a single syllable. Leaning closer, his large, heavy hand slid upward, his thick fingers gently wrapping around the fragile column of her throat. "Why?" he whispered, the rough timbre of his voice vibrating against her skin. "Why can't I do anything bad to you?" Every point of contact sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her veins. Her mind flashed violently back to the mountain, the smell of blood, the chase, and the forced contract binding them together. She needed an armor, a conceptual cage that even a monster wouldn't dare break. Suddenly, a stray piece of advice from her eccentric manager echoed through her panic. Destiny isn't found. It is chosen through absolute foresight. A dangerous, desperate spark lit up her eyes. "Because if you kill me," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs, "it would be uxoricide." For the very first time, a fracture of genuine emotion broke through his smooth, stone-like face. His brow furrowed in deep confusion, and the heavy medical needle slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. Lee-yeon didn't let herself hesitate. She swallowed her conscience, locked her expression into a mask of pure, unyielding certainty, and planted a deadly, irreversible seed into his blank mind. "Because I am your wife." The truly life-altering twists of fate are always impossible to predict. They arrive like a sudden lightning strike in the dead of night. The next afternoon, Lee-yeon stood beneath the blazing island sun, staring at an ancient, blackened tree that had been literally split clean down the center. The weeping owner clutched Lee-yeon's hands, terrified that the death of this birth tree foreshadowed tragedy for her son away in the military. Kneeling in the dirt, Lee-yeon gently inspected the charred bark. To her, a tree's pain was palpable, a physical ache she could diagnose. She quietly instructed Chu-ja to prep the surgical kit, determined to bind the fractured trunk with chains and save the remaining roots. But Chu-ja was barely looking at the tree. She was staring at Lee-yeon. Under the harsh, unforgiving daylight, the young doctor looked utterly ghost-like, the dark, heavy bruising under her eyes betraying weeks of sleepless horror. Before Chu-ja could pry, Lee-yeon's phone buzzed. Seeing the caller ID, the professional, grounded aura she maintained for her clients instantly shattered. She slipped away into the quiet shadows of the brush, biting her nails, pacing like a desperate gambler running from a collection agency. It had been a month since the monster had awakened, uttered those vulgar words, and instantly collapsed the moment she claimed to be his wife. The private medical keeper had whisked him away for neurological testing, and now, the voice on the other end of the line was delivering a piece of news so absurd her mind struggled to process it. "We simply cannot predict when he will open his eyes again," the doctor stated calmly. "What do you mean?" Lee-yeon whispered, her eyes trembling beneath the brim of her straw hat. "Don't toy with me. He was awake. He was talking to me. He was pinning me down." The doctor cleared his throat, explaining the bizarre anomaly. The brain scans confirmed his consciousness had officially returned from the coma, yet he had immediately slipped into a rare psychological defense mechanism. Hypersomnia, often whispered about as the Sleeping Beauty syndrome. His mind was perfectly intact, but it was choosing to retreat into deep, unbreakable slumber. Currently, the patient has been asleep for 12 consecutive days, the doctor continued. When he falls under, it could be for a week, 10 days, or even longer. We are sending him back to your care. Lee-yeon held her breath, the wind catching her sweaty forehead as she lifted her hat. The crushing, suffocating weight that had been building in her chest for a month suddenly vanished, evaporating into the ocean breeze. A manic, breathless laugh nearly escaped her lips. "So, you are saying he is technically awake, but no one has any idea when he will actually open his eyes?" "Yes. For now, it is entirely unpredictable." "Thank you." Lee-yeon wept silently, tears of pure, exquisite relief slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you so much, Doctor." The cosmic joke of it all was beautiful. The terrifying lie she had told, the dangerous trap of naming herself a killer's wife, didn't matter anymore. When he finally woke up weeks or months from now, she could simply smile, tilt her head, and tell him the entire thing had been nothing but a vivid, feverish dream. Wiping her face, Lee-yeon stepped back onto the scorched grass, her posture lighter, her voice filled with a sudden, radiant optimism as she looked at her grieving client. "Don't worry," she said, a genuine smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. I will do absolutely everything in my power to bring this tree back to life. The relief that washed over Lee-yeon was built on a foundation of absolute, catastrophic ignorance. Miles away, the private medical keeper looked at his phone in deep bewilderment before slipping it back into his pocket. He couldn't comprehend the pure joy in the tree doctor's voice. To him, Kwon Chae-woo's condition was anything but a blessing. The man was a genetic anomaly. Despite 2 years in a vegetative state, his bones had remained dense, his motor nerves incredibly resilient. His physical recovery over a single week had been miraculous, allowing him to move his massive frame with terrifying ease. But then, the sudden retreat into a 12-day slumber. The doctor walked down the empty hospital hallway, a heavy frown settling on his face as he recalled the final, hazy moments before the patient drifted under. He had leaned over the bed, asking the man to speak whatever came to his mind. And Chae-woo had rasped out a single, repeating phrase. Please, don't wake up. It wasn't his own desire, it was an echo. The man was mimicking the exact, desperate prayer Lee-yeon had whispered over his body for months. The doctor stretched, letting out a tired yawn. It was strange, really. Director Kwon was a man of immense power, so why insist on keeping his brother hidden in a shabby, isolated island clinic instead of a top-tier city facility? But the salary was far too high to ask dangerous questions. Suddenly, the doctor snapped his fingers in the dark. He had forgotten to mention a minor detail to Lee-yeon. The Sleeping Beauty Syndrome, or Klein-Levin syndrome, didn't just cause prolonged sleep. When the patient finally crossed back into consciousness, it was almost always accompanied by extreme behavioral abnormalities, an insatiable, uncontrollable urge to gorge on food, animalistic aggression, and an intense, hyperactive sexual desire. The doctor shrugged, checking his watch. It's just one night, he reasoned. Surely, nothing could happen in a single night. On the island, Lee-yeon was practically humming as she climbed the stairs. She felt like a death row inmate who had just received a miraculous, last-minute pardon. But the moment she reached the landing, a sickening sense of déjà vu froze the breath in her throat. The heavy back door, built specifically to keep the monster contained, had been violently splintered, pushed outward as if it had been struck by a roaring vehicle. He was gone. 4:30 agonizing minutes. Lee-yeon stumbled through the pitch-black dirt roads of the neighborhood, illuminated only by the pale, buzzing glow of a few distant electric poles. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen, rubbing the glass until it was polished bright. She desperately wanted to call Director Kwon, but giving that dangerous man an excuse to tighten the noose around her neck was out of the question. Tying her wavy hair back, she forced her legs to move faster, calling his name into the dark. Only the distant barking of guard dogs answered. Then, she saw it. A heavy, disturbing trail carved into the damp earth. It looked exactly like the path left behind by a massive, crawling serpent. A dry, breathless laugh escaped her lips. The absurdity of her life was staggering. Following the track into a secluded thicket, a sudden, frantic fluttering sound made her heart slam against her ribs. She broke through the brush, and the scene before her made the blood run completely cold in her veins. Kwon Chae-woo, put that down, she gasped. But it was already too late. In the heavy shadows, Chae-woo was hunched over, his jaw moving in rhythmic, brutal strokes as he tore into raw, bloody flesh. His eyes were entirely vacant, glazed over and completely disconnected from reality. With a low, animalistic groan, he spat a piece of raw meat onto the grass. At his feet lay a dead rooster, its neck violently snapped. Lee-yeon fought a wave of intense, burning nausea. The man stood there nonchalantly, the silver moonlight catching the fresh, dark crimson dripping from his lower lip. He was entirely lost to the dark side effects of his syndrome, a prisoner to a ravenous, primal hunger. Forcing her voice into a gentle, mock-professional tone, she tried to manage the beast. It must be so difficult for you to move right now. Why did you come outside? Let's go back. You shouldn't be here. Chae-woo tossed the mangled bird aside, his heavy gaze slowly locking onto her. As he stepped out of the shadows, he seemed impossibly larger, towering over her by a full 2 heads. He didn't walk so much as glide toward her, his clothes covered in dirt and dust, the fabric fluttering in the night wind to reveal the hard, sculpted contours of a body built for violence. Looking at him, Lee-yeon's mind flashed to a rare botanical wonder, the dragon blood tree of Socotra Island. A strange, ancient thing that bled a thick, deep red sap whenever its bark was pierced. 2 years ago, she had met him in a pool of blood. A month ago, he had awakened drenched in it. And tonight, he stood before her with stained lips. Kwon Chae-woo. She whispered, stepping back. Name. His voice rumbled, low and freezing. What? What is your name? His light, unblinking irises bore into her soul, completely unreadable. Lee-yeon's mind went entirely blank. She had told this monster she was his wife, but she had never given him a name, and in the suffocating silence of the dark road, the trap was closing in once again. The silence of the midnight road was suddenly broken by the rough, demanding timbre of his voice, cutting through her panic before she could even formulate a reply. "Where were you this whole time?" he murmured, his brow furrowing as a wave of genuine, primal confusion washed over his features. "The only face left in my head is yours, but I couldn't open the door." A cold shiver rippled straight down Lee-yeon's spine. He had been trapped. The heavy, deadbolt door on the second floor only opened from the outside, to keep the monster contained. To escape, he had literally shattered the lower exit, crawling through the dirt like a wounded, predatory beast just to follow her scent. He was completely volatile, awakening from a 12-day slumber drenched in sweat, mud, and the fresh blood of a slaughtered animal. Yet, in his confusion, Lee-yeon saw a desperate, final glimmer of hope. It was time to rewrite reality. I have no idea what you're talking about," she lied smoothly, keeping her expression perfectly flat. "You must have had a very long, exceptionally vivid dream." She took a cautious step forward, gesturing toward the shadows. "This belongs to the village foreman. We need to leave before someone sees us. I will pay for the damage." Chae-woo didn't move. His pale, piercing eyes remained locked on her face, devouring every micro-expression. "Kwon Chae-woo, listen to me," she urged, putting a calculated emphasis on her words. "You have been profoundly ill, unconscious for a long time. It is completely natural for your mind to be fractured right now. But it was just a dream. You are fully awake now. Everything you think you saw or heard, it was just your brain trying to cope with the trauma. You need rest, inside, where it's safe." It was a brilliant psychological play, or so she thought. She completely underestimated the raw, carnal instincts of the man standing before her. "A dream?" Chae-woo echoed softly. His tongue slowly, deliberately slid across his lower lip, wiping away the dark crimson stain of the feast. A dark, knowing clarity finally filled his gaze. "I see," he whispered, his eyes dropping slowly, scanning down the lines of her body. "If it really was a dream, you wouldn't be standing here like this." Lee-yeon froze, a knot of sudden apprehension tightening in her stomach. "Because the entire time I slept." His voice dropped to a low, gravelly purr, vibrating with a sudden, intense heat. "I dreamed of nothing but touch. I was lost between the legs of my wife." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her lungs seized, and she almost screamed into the empty night. The heavy side effects the doctor forgot to mention were boiling to the surface, an insatiable, hyperactive hunger that was no longer about food. "So, I am not confused at all," he continued, taking a slow, heavy step toward her. "I remember the heat, distinctly. I have a wife, and right now, she looks exactly like she's trying to run away from me." He advanced with a terrifying, unhurried rhythm, neither too fast nor too slow, like a predator who knew the prey had nowhere left to run. Lee-yeon's knees trembled violently. The intricate, clever trap she had designed to protect herself had snapped shut, and she was the one caught in the teeth. "Did you want to abandon me?" he asked, his tone dropping into a dangerous, sharp cynicism. "Because your husband woke up broken, a useless piece of flesh." He wasn't a fool. Amnesia hadn't dulled his lethal edge. "What is your name?" he demanded, stopping just inches away, the heat radiating from his massive frame suffocating her. "Don't make me ask you a third time." I am Saw Lee-yeon." She choked out, her hands trembling against her sides. "So, Lee-yeon." He repeated it, swallowing her name along with the last traces of iron on his lips, memorizing the texture of the syllables. Why leave me? Am I truly that worthless to you now? A heavy, invisible pressure seemed to wrap around her ankles, heavy as iron shackles, pulling her down into a dark, inescapable swamp. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but the gravity of his presence held her pinned. Kwon Chae-woo, that's not, you misunderstand. She stammered, frantically looking for an exit. Is it? The tables had completely turned. Lee-yeon stood in the dirt, nervously twisting her fingers, desperately trying to patch the holes in her failing armor. A wife you don't even remember suddenly appeared. She whispered, trying to sound maternal, protective. I thought my presence would overwhelm you, that it would hinder your recovery. I only did it for your own good, for your safety. Chae-woo stared down at her, his face entirely blank, devoid of any warmth. Bullshit, he said bluntly. The sudden shift back to his polite, yet utterly frozen tone was dizzying. Why decide what's good for me without asking? I don't want your distance. Someone tore my mind apart, cleared out every memory, but your face is the only thing they couldn't erase. I must belong to you. The moment I realized you were trying to discard me, I lost my mind. Because you are inherently, naturally evil. Lee-yeon thought bitterly, her jaw locked in terror. I am dead. I am genuinely dead. She had to maintain the facade. If she broke down now, if she admitted the truth, he would tear her apart on this dark road. She had believed his amnesia was her greatest weapon, a tool to steer the beast wherever she wished. But the beast had rewritten the script. I guess. Chae-woo murmured, his large hand reaching out to gently trace the red mark on her cheek. I must have loved you terribly much. No. You didn't, you absolute idiot. Her mind screamed in pure, dark comedy. You tried to murder me in the mountains. The irony was exquisite, and entirely fatal. Her desperate lie had successfully cured his murderous intent, only to transform it into something far more dangerous, an obsessive, consuming love. The quiet of the island night was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic, scraping sound of a wooden cart moving down the dirt path, and the frantic, buzzing chorus of invisible crickets. Lee-yeon strained every muscle to pull the heavy cart, feeling the burning, unblinking weight of his gaze directly on her back. She didn't dare look around. How old am I? His voice suddenly rasped from the shadows behind her, leaning back against the wooden frame. A million dangerous variables flashed through her mind. This conversation wasn't just a discussion. It was a psychological minefield. One wrong step, one inconsistent detail, and her fragile safety would evaporate into the dark. She stopped, turning slightly to look at the sharp, flawless contours of his face. In the pale moonlight, he looked entirely unwrinkled, completely handsome. He could have passed for a college student, or a sharp, cold businessman in a tailored suit. 32. She whispered, her voice barely holding together. You are the same age as me. He nodded, slowly digesting the digit. But, do we always speak so formally to one another? Yes. She lied instantly. The fabrication tasted bitter like copper on her tongue. You have always been incredibly polite, a true gentleman. It was terrifying how naturally a lie could branch out, much like a wild ivy strangling a tree. Once a single seed of deception took root, it grew entirely out of control. And what did I do for a living? He asked, his tone flat, yet deeply probing. Lee-yeon's breath hitched. You bury people alive, she wanted to scream. You plant breathing bodies into the cold earth and watch the life drain from them. As her hesitation stretched into an agonizing silence, she felt a heavy, warm hand tap her elbow, sliding up to rest on her shoulder. Panic took the wheel, and she blurted out the first ridiculous thing that came to her mind. You planted things expertly. Planted what? Flowers. She stammered, wishing she could physically sew her own mouth shut. You planted beautiful flowers at my botanical clinic. That is exactly how we met. Back inside the dim house, the reality of his physical state became painfully clear. He was a total mess, covered in thick grime, dried dirt, and fresh, angry scratches from his crawl through the thicket. After forcing him into a cold shower, Lee-yeon sat on the edge of the mattress, her fingers trembling violently as she dabbed soothing ointment onto his bruised skin. Chae-woo didn't flinch. He didn't even groan. His chest merely rose and fell with a terrifying, calm regularity. She just wanted the night to end. She wanted him to slip back into the dark. "Let's sleep here, together," he murmured, breaking the silence. Lee-yeon's entire body rigidified. "What? We are married, aren't we?" His light eyes locked onto hers, a piercing, unreadable depth within them. "Can't we share this space? I am no longer a vegetable, and I am still your husband." She instinctively rose from the mattress, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. In her haste to survive the road, she had never considered what playing the part of a devoted wife would actually require in the dark. "Are you uncomfortable around me?" he asked softly, his voice tilting into a bleak, almost sorrowful cadence. "Because I am not the man you remember." She couldn't find her voice. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "It's all right," he whispered, pulling the edge of the blanket back. "I will not treat you harshly. I won't force you, or threaten you. I will be exactly like the gentle husband you used to know. So, sleep here with me." The doctor's warning echoed in her mind. Once he falls asleep, he might not wake for weeks. Falling under was the priority. If she refused, his volatile aggression might return. With a swallowed breath, she lay down beside his massive, radiating frame. The scent of sharp disinfectant drifted between them. She kept her eyes glued to the ceiling, avoiding the proximity of his face. "I have so many questions," he said, turning his head to watch her profile. His gaze felt like an arrow piercing the dark. "What are you most curious about?" she whispered back. "How did I end up like that? A helpless vegetative man. We went up into the mountains together." She lied smoothly, keeping the narrative dangerously vague. "There was an accident, a terrible storm." "Were you hurt too?" His brow furrowed. "Not badly, no. I have been taking care of you ever since, though the medical staff did most of the heavy lifting." She was walking on microscopic glass. If he ever discovered the truth, that she was the one who had hunted him, that his brother was the one keeping him caged, he would snap her neck without a second thought. "Only think about your recovery for now," she urged, desperately trying to shift his focus. "You have a family, an older brother. You will meet them soon." "I don't remember any brother," Chae-woo muttered. His large, heavy hand slid across the sheets, wrapping around hers. The simple touch felt like a heavy iron chain binding her entire body to his. "The only person I need, the only one who matters, is you, Lee-yeon," he whispered, his voice laced with a strange, confusing yearning. "Your face is the only anchor left in my mind. I must have loved you terribly much." Love. The word felt absurd, dangerous. She held back the instinctive urge to scream at him. Instead, she watched as he lifted himself slightly, draping the thick, warm quilt over both of their shoulders. The sudden, heavy warmth was undeniably cozy, absorbing the agonizing fatigue of her long day. As she instinctively burrowed into the heat, her eyes collided with his light, intense irises. "When did we get married?" 2 years ago. She breathed. "Have you cried a lot because of me?" His gaze softened. To be newlyweds, and to spend all that time nursing a broken man. That sounds terrible. "I am a doctor. I am used to caring for patients who cannot speak," she replied, her chest tightening. "I didn't cry." "How long did we date before the wedding?" The questions were spinning into a complex web she hadn't prepared for. Lee-yeon had been single her entire life. How was she supposed to invent a romance with a literal monster? "We didn't date long," she stammered. We married almost immediately after meeting." Chae-woo raised his dark eyebrows, a low, slow rumble escaping his throat. "Immediately?" She panicked, thinking of the lightning-fast international marriages she often witnessed among the locals on the island. Had she made a mistake? Before she could correct herself, a sudden, mocking smirk played on his lips. "One night?" he asked, his voice dripping with a sensual, teasing weight. "What? Did we spend one night together right after meeting? And you decided I was the perfect partner?" Lee-yeon's mouth opened and closed in absolute, horrified shock. But as she stared at him, his cynical mask dissolved into a genuine, surprisingly boyish smile. The cold, distant terror in his eyes vanished, replaced by something deeply human. It was like waking up inside a beautifully orchestrated nightmare. "I guess," he murmured, settling his head back onto the pillow, his eyes still fixed on her flushed face. "You were quite bold back then." "No. That's completely wrong. That's not how it was," she protested, her face burning with immense discomfort. But she had no truth to offer as a shield. The silence returned, heavy, warm, and terrifyingly intimate, as the killer slept peacefully beside his newly invented wife. The trap she had carefully set was now twisting, reshaping itself into an entirely different kind of nightmare. "Ah, so I picked you up," Chae-woo murmured, a dark, amused smile playing on his lips as he leaned back against the pillows. "I whispered sweet nothings into your ear and dragged you straight to bed, right? I really was a shameless bastard." He was genuinely enjoying this, savoring the fabricated pieces of a romantic past he couldn't remember. But for Lee-yeon, the proximity was becoming physically oppressive. Cold sweat trickled down the valley of her spine. She was trapped under the same blanket with a literal monster, a man who believed they were bound by holy matrimony. If she didn't put up a psychological barrier right now, the natural progression of this lie would eventually lead to something she couldn't survive. She needed a weapon to castrate his interest, and she needed it immediately. "You actually weren't shameless at all," she blurted out, her voice tight, cutting through the warmth of the bed. "The truth is, we simply weren't sexually compatible." The easy, boyish smile slowly bled out of his face, replaced by a heavy, dangerous stillness. "It wasn't good?" he asked, his tone dropping an octave. "The intimacy?" "No." "Who?" he pushed, his pale eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, suffocating intensity. "What? Who wasn't good at it?" Lee-yeon forced herself not to blink, holding onto his piercing gaze with every ounce of her fading courage. Before she could fabricate an answer, he let out a short, dry laugh, though his expression remained deeply serious. "Both of us," he muttered, rubbing his face as if trying to process a physical blow. "This is arguably more shocking than the actual memory loss." The amicable, confused patient from moments ago was gone. In his place sat a man whose eyes felt entirely too sharp, too ancient. He leaned closer, his soft voice carrying a subdued, yet unwavering determination. "So, you are telling me we just stopped doing it altogether?" "Yes." Lee-yeon rushed out, digging deep into her adult composure to prevent her voice from trembling. She had to make the lie absolute. "We just didn't fit. I didn't feel anything the first time. I still don't even know what an orgasm is. And back then, you told me you had an incredibly low libido. You didn't care for physical intimacy at all. That was actually what I loved most about you. You were like a monk, content with just pure, platonic love." "A monk? Me?" Chae-woo stared at her in utter disbelief, his thick brows furrowing as he attempted to reconcile his brutal, muscular physique with the image of a celibate, fragile husband. He fell entirely silent, turning his gaze up to the ceiling. The quiet stretched for so long that Lee-yeon believed her final blow had successfully put him to sleep. But just as she began to slide her hand away, his voice rumbled through the dark once more. "So, you stayed by my side for 2 years, nursing a broken body, even though we shared no physical pleasure." He let out a long, heavy sigh, his fingers tightening around hers. "You really do love me a lot," saw Lee-yeon. A wave of profound, dark irony washed over her. Her desperate attempt to keep him at arm's length had only solidified his belief in her undying devotion. But she didn't dare correct him. The deeper he believed this illusion, the safer she would be from his primal instincts. Go to sleep now, she whispered, desperate to close the door on this interrogation before she tripped over her own words. Okay. Good night, Lee-yeon. He turned his massive back to her, closing his eyes to digest the disappointing history of his past self. Left alone with her thoughts, Lee-yeon silently prayed to the god of trees. Please, let the doctor's diagnosis be true. Let him fall into a deep, unbroken slumber for weeks. A coma would be preferable. Just don't let him wake up. She lay perfectly still, waiting for his breathing to even out. But just as she thought he was gone, a faint, masculine whisper drifted across the pillow. But why exactly wasn't I good? Was it the technique, or was I simply too inexperienced? Did I finish too quickly? Lee-yeon bit her lips so hard she tasted iron, cursing herself internally for opening this door. I think you just didn't enjoy it, and yes, it was over very fast. That finally silenced him. A heavy, profound quiet settled over the room as his breath slowed into a deep sleep. She tried to pry her fingers from his grip, but his hand remained an unyielding vice even in slumber. Exhaustion finally claimed her, her mind drifting off with one lingering, unanswered question. Why did you kill that chicken so cruelly? The next morning, the bright island sun filtered through the window. Lee-yeon opened her eyes, feeling surprisingly well rested, until her gaze shifted upward. A sharp, blood-curdling scream tore from her throat. Kwon Chae-woo was already awake, propped up on one elbow, staring down at her with a calm, unblinking intensity. Good morning, he murmured, his voice smooth and entirely alert. The psychological whiplash was absolute. Sleeping Beauty syndrome? 12 days of unbroken slumber. The doctor had promised he would be asleep for weeks, yet here he was, awake before her, his flax-colored irises catching the morning light with a strange, reddish hue. The monster wasn't sleeping, and the nightmare was just beginning. The fragile illusion of safety didn't just crack, it shattered into a million jagged pieces by the very next morning. Lee-yeon stood trapped in the far corner of the clinic room, her fingers restlessly pulling at her sleeves, her teeth digging into her nails until they bled. Her eyes flitted constantly toward the massive figure undergoing evaluation, a suffocating knot of panic tightening in her chest. The medical universe had promised her weeks of unbroken silence, yet the universe had lied. It is entirely too early to map out a definitive pattern, the doctor murmured, his pen scratching rhythmically against the clipboard. The data is volatile. He might still slip back into a prolonged slumber tomorrow. We must wait. But for Lee-yeon, tomorrow was a lifetime away. Today, Kwon Chae-woo had simply opened his eyes like a normal man. The beautiful promise of the Sleeping Beauty syndrome had vanished, leaving her exposed to the beast she had casually tried to brainwash. It felt like a physical stab in the back. His neurological pathways are perfectly intact, the doctor continued, completely blind to the thick tension in the room. This regression is likely psychological. A shift in scenery from the sterile hospital to a domestic home can trigger a sudden awakening. We just need to isolate the exact catalyst for this lucidity. From across the room, Chae-woo's heavy gaze drifted over to her. A slow, dark amusement flickered in his wood-colored eyes as his thumb deliberately traced his lower lip. There is one specific catalyst that comes to mind, he rasped, his voice cutting through the clinical silence. The doctor looked up. And what might that be? I slept in the same bed as my wife last night. An agonizing, freezing silence descended upon the room. Lee-yeon's blood ran completely cold. The doctor slowly blinked, his eyes shifting like a pendulum between the looming patient and the trembling botanist. Clearing his throat, he managed a clinical nod. Am I to understand that you indulged in physical intimacy? No. Lee-yeon choked out, her voice sharp with desperation. We merely shared the mattress. Nothing of the sort happened. The doctor simply nodded, a subtle, professional shrug of his shoulders. Then let us maintain that exact environment for now. If proximity stabilizes his consciousness, continue sharing the bed and let us observe the results. Lee-yeon's face darkened into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Later that afternoon, while Chae-woo was escorted to physical therapy, Lee-yeon collapsed onto the worn sofa, the distant drone of the television washing over her like a low fever. On the screen, a news anchor droned on about the psychological cruelty of voice phishing syndicates. They isolate the victims, the reporter explained, threatening that if they hang up, it will be treated as an admission of guilt, keeping them too terrified to seek outside help. The word struck a deep, vibrating chord within her soul. 2 years ago, in the dead of night, Director Kwon had done the exact same thing to her, isolating her, threatening her with murder charges, forcing her into a toxic, legal contract while her mind was fractured with trauma. For a solid month, since the monster had opened his eyes, she hadn't slept a single, peaceful hour. Her life wasn't just sliding downhill, it was drowning in a swamp. As the reporter's voice faded into static, a sudden, frantic clarity washed over her. She couldn't carry the weight of this corpse alone anymore. With trembling fingers, she dialed a familiar number. The line rings once, twice, and the heavy dam of tears she had held back for 2 agonizing years finally burst. "Why are you calling me on a weekend?" Choo-ja's voice barked through the speaker. "Choo-ja, I don't know what to do." Lee-yeon sobbed, her voice cracking into tiny, pathetic pieces. "What is wrong with you? Are you drunk?" "A vegetative man." Lee-yeon wept, the secret pouring out of her like blood from a fresh wound. "There is a vegetative man, and he is going to be working with us at the clinic." The confession was an absolute mess of gibberish, a chaotic flood of ancient trauma and current terror. It was enough to make Choo-ja drop everything and race directly to the hospital. When the older woman burst through the door, she instinctively took a step back. Lee-yeon was unrecognizable, her eyes bloodshot, her nose red, her lips swollen from crying, surrounded by a mountain of shredded tissues. Choo-ja immediately knelt, checking beneath the cushions and the base of the sofa, half expecting to find empty bottles of hard liquor. "Choo-ja, please." There was no alcohol, only the raw, shattering reality of a girl who never cried, breaking entirely to pieces. "Why didn't you call the police?" Choo-ja yelled, her voice a mix of fury and absolute bewilderment as the story finally settled in. A murder in the mountains, a chase, a coma, and now, a monster hidden in the upper room. "I didn't have a choice. I have never heard anything so insanely stupid in my entire life." Choo-ja groaned, throwing her hands up in dark, exasperated humor. "I knew you were reckless the moment you started spraying expensive plant nutrients on wild mountain weeds, but bringing an actual, breathing vegetable into a botanical clinic. Brilliant. Truly magnificent." She paused, her eyes softening as she looked at the weeping girl. "Why are you only telling me this now?" Lee-yeon hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. It broke Choo-ja's heart. Deep down, Lee-yeon had never changed. She was still that same, fiercely lonely little girl who grew up without anyone to lean on, an adult on the outside, but completely locked away, only truly open to the silent, unjudging plants she tended. The anger in Choo-ja's chest melted away, replaced by a rough, protective warmth. She sat down tightly beside her on the cushions. "So, you've been hiding a man this entire time." "A vegetative man," Lee-yeon corrected weakly, wiping her nose. "Fine. A vegetable. So how do we fix this? How do I help?" Lee-yeon looked up, more tears fresh on her eyelashes, her mouth opening to thank her only friend, but Choo-ja awkwardly patted her back, cutting her off. "Save the gratitude. Just tell me what needs to be done." "Okay." Lee-yeon swallowed hard, staring into the shadows of the staircase where the monster would eventually return. "Before we do anything, there is one minor detail you need to know. I may have lied to him, and told him that I am his wife." The roaring thunder of Choo-ja's voice shattered whatever remaining calm lingered in the clinic. "What?" she bellowed, her hand freezing midair above Lee-yeon's back. "Are you completely, entirely out of your mind?" Lee-yeon practically leaped from the cushions, scrambling around the furniture like a hunted animal using the sofa as a barricade. "He remembers nothing. Choo-ja. Absolutely nothing. His mind is a blank slate. The second he opened his eyes, he pinned me down. His grip was like iron. I was terrified. I lied so he wouldn't snap my neck right then and there. A lie like that has an expiration date. Lee-yeon. You can't bury the truth forever. You didn't see him. Lee-yeon gasped, her chest heaving as the horrific imagery of that rainy night in the mountains flashed behind her eyelids. The mud, the rain, the shovel. He was burying a living, breathing human being into the dirt. He is a monster who would slit your throat just for looking him in the eye. I had to survive. What if he dragged me into the woods and buried me next? She stood trembling, hands planted on her waist, a stubborn, desperate glint cutting through the tears in her eyes. I just want my life back. I've worked so hard, so desperately hard just to build a quiet, peaceful existence. Chu-ja watched her, the anger slowly draining from her face, filled instead with a profound, heavy pity. Lee-yeon was a fighter. She didn't fold easily. But the absolute terror of losing the steering wheel of her own life to a predator was driving her to the edge of sanity. And what happens when the illusion shatters? Chu-ja muttered. I just need to find the real culprit, the one who orchestrated all of this. Lee-yeon whispered, her voice hollow as she tried to convince herself. Her long, unkempt hair hung down her back like a ghost's veil. Her mind drifted back to the heavy, vibrating weight of the power saw she had swung that night. It had been a desperate, brutal strike, enough to put a giant into a 2-year coma. That was the exact moment her universe had spun completely out of orbit. She refused to be a puppet. She had invented the marriage to create a psychological cage, an artificial bond of absolute closeness that even an inherent monster wouldn't dare violate. But to Chu-ja, a veteran of the world, this logic was completely flawed. Lee-yeon was painfully naive. She didn't understand how volatile, how rapidly intimate a relationship between a man and a woman could become when confined to a single bedroom, especially with a man who had blood on his hands. No. Count me out. I am not dipping my toes into this grave. Chu-ja said, shaking her head. Please. Lee-yeon begged, her voice cracking. Please, just play along. Just pretend we are married, and that you've always known. Please. Chu-ja. Chu-ja pressed her fingers tightly against her throbbing temples. She had been married 5 times. She had buried 3 husbands, mourning each one. She knew the mechanics of human nature better than anyone. And something about this entire setup smelled entirely rotten. Why was a man of obvious wealth and immense power hidden away in a crumbling, seaside clinic instead of a luxury facility in Seoul? Why was the older brother using threats to force Lee-yeon into compliance? Where were the parents? Lee-yeon. A deep, authoritative voice suddenly drifted down from the stairwell. The sheer weight of the tone made Chu-ja's eyes widen. It was a voice that didn't just speak, it commanded the oxygen in the room. Both women turned slowly toward the stairs. Kwon Chae-woo descended, his massive frame moving with a slow, fluid grace. Chu-ja, caught completely off guard, let her maternal instincts take the wheel before her brain could stop her. Hello, my son. She blurted out. I've never heard of a hospital, 4 trees. Chae-woo murmured, his light, pale wood-colored eyes scanning the rustic, leaf-draped interior of the clinic. Lee-yeon sat on the opposite cushions, her body rocking slightly back and forth, a subconscious, animalistic reflex to keep from sprinting out the front door. Chu-ja, meanwhile, was quietly dissecting the man with her gaze. She possessed decades of human data, having studied the ancient art of physiognomy, face reading, under a master monk. She had never misread a soul in her life. And looking at the man before her, the puzzle pieces didn't fit. This was the beast who buried people alive. He was breathtakingly handsome, his expression cold, neat, and perfectly refined. His long, level eyes held a striking, soft warmth beneath the ice. He didn't carry the raw, clumsy aura of a back-alley killer. He looked glamorous, born into absolute, old-money luxury. A man of immense, terrifying authority. Mother. Chae-woo spoke, his voice polite, though his lips moved stiffly, as if the word itself was a foreign language he was forcing himself to learn. May I move? I want to sit next to Lee-yeon. Chu-ja, usually entirely unshakable under pressure, momentarily lost her composure, blinking in stunned silence. Lee-yeon froze entirely, sensing the awkward, suffocating hesitation. Lee-yeon quietly slid across the sofa, closing the distance to sit directly beside him. Instantly, the tension in Chae-woo's shoulders bled out. His light eyes softened, filled with an intense, visible relief. Kwon Chae-woo. Lee-yeon stammered, her skin prickling at his proximity. She isn't my mother. She's the manager here. She's known me for 15 years. I think she just called you son because she wants you to feel welcome. Chae-woo tilted his head, his gaze dropping to her lips. Why do you call me by my full name? What? I want you to feel comfortable with me, too, wife. Lee-yeon's throat locked, completely stripped of words, while Chu-ja quietly rubbed her forehead in absolute, psychological exhaustion. Amnesia had erased his past, his sins, and his identity, but it had left him with a singular, obsessive focus. His eyes didn't care about the clinic, the trees, or the world outside. They were completely, terrifyingly locked onto Lee-yeon. A dangerous game of proximity is a double-edged sword, and Lee-yeon was slowly sliding her palm down the blade. Is Chu-ja important to you? Chae-woo murmured, his deep baritone cutting through the humid air of the greenhouse clinic. Yes, very. Lee-yeon managed to whisper, her voice barely catching in her throat. Chae-woo nodded slowly, his pale, wood-colored eyes never releasing her. Then I must work to earn her favor. Before Lee-yeon could even begin to protest, he turned his imposing frame fully toward the older woman. Mother, I must apologize. It seems whatever promises I made to you before the wedding, my fractured mind cannot recall them right now. Chu-ja didn't skip a beat, her veteran instincts masking any trace of surprise. Oh. I knew those promises were gone the moment you went to sleep for 12 days straight. She replied smoothly, her eyes cutting a knowing look toward Lee-yeon. Lee-yeon told me I used to be gentle and polite. Chae-woo continued, his voice laced with a strange, mechanical calm. Oh, yes, you were a saint. Chu-ja smiled, a sharp, internal chuckle echoing in her thoughts at how easily her naive young friend had woven this elaborate trap. It will take time. Chae-woo mused, his fingers trailing along the edge of his jaw. To become the husband she remembers. But the doctor assured me it won't be long. The human mind possesses a terrifying inertia, a subconscious hunger to return to its true form. At the word true form, a visible shiver ran down Lee-yeon's spine. The predator was waking up, and his instincts were restoring the very beast she had tried to cage. Lee-yeon, when do I start working at the clinic? He asked suddenly. Working? Her eyes went wide. No. You need to rest. Your recovery is the only thing that matters. If you stay quiet, it makes me less anxious. She frantically rubbed her sweaty palms against her trousers, her heart hammering against her ribs. Chae-woo. He corrected, his voice dropping an octave. What? He draped a heavy, muscular arm over the back of the sofa, leaning into her personal space. It's Chae-woo. Call me Chae-woo. He tilted his head down, forcing her to look into the abyss of his gaze. To Lee-yeon, it felt exactly like standing in the dark woods with a cold blade pressed firmly against her jugular. The sheer, psychological pressure turned her face a ghostly white. Seeing her pale, Chae-woo suddenly dropped his forehead onto his forearm, his dark, sharp eyebrows still visible, twitching with a strange, agonizing frustration. Do you no longer see me as a man? He rasped. The sudden, suffocating shift in the room's atmosphere dragged Lee-yeon straight back to that muddy mountain slope, back to the absolute terror of his conscious presence. She couldn't move a single finger. I am an absolute fool with only one functioning concept left in my head. He muttered, letting out a dry, hollow laugh. Your face. Lee-yeon felt as though she were sitting on a bed of needles. Every breath was a gamble. You don't understand what it feels like. Chae-woo whispered, his brow furrowing as if in physical pain. It is driving me insane. A mind entirely wiped clean, except for the blurry image of a woman I am supposed to love. It terrifies me to think that if I don't look at you, even that memory will fade. Against her own judgment, a sharp pang of pity struck Lee-yeon's chest. He looked so broken, so human. If that happens, I'm afraid I'll want to become a very bad husband, he murmured. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers gently stroking her pale cheek. The contrast was paralyzing. His fingertips were ice-cold, and a flash of pure horror crossed her mind. She half expected him to be hiding a garrote wire or a lethal syringe in his palm. Her pulse was racing as if she had just sprinted 100 meters away from a grave. Watching the suffocating tension from across the room, Chu-ja quietly pulled out her phone, her face hardening. This isn't just any ordinary man, she realized. He is something far more dangerous. It was time to find out exactly whose ghost they were harboring. By midnight, Lee-yeon had barricaded herself on the first floor, using an endless mountain of paperwork as an excuse. There was absolutely no way she was sharing a mattress with that man tonight. She wanted nothing more than to lock the heavy wooden door separating the floors. But the lock was broken by Chae-woo himself on the day he woke up. Peeking through a tiny crack in the stairwell door, her breath caught. Chae-woo was dripping with sweat, his bare upper body gleaming under the pale bulb as he performed rhythmic, relentless push-ups. He wasn't even panting. The lean, withered form of the vegetative patient was gone, replaced by a sculpted, massive back, bulging veins, and a terrifyingly fast recovery rate. I can understand the quiet language of plants, she thought, but never the violent appetite of a beast. Fleeing to her small bedroom, she slammed the door shut, a sharp, stabbing pain blooming at the back of her skull. All evening, a single question had consumed her sanity. How do you escape the bedroom of a husband you invented? A sharp, deliberate knock echoed through the wood. Lee-yeon. His low, toneless voice called out. Through the gap at the bottom of the old door where the paint had chipped away, she could see the dark shadow of his feet. It was the first time she realized just how thin and flimsy that wooden barrier truly was. She scrambled into bed, pulling the thick blanket entirely over her head to drown out the world. Just go away, please. Just leave, she prayed. But since her childhood, the universe had never granted her mercy. Her prayers had always gone entirely unanswered. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled violently, shaking against its hinges as if it were about to be ripped from the frame. Lee-yeon bit her lip until it bled, forcing her body to remain completely still, pretending to be dead to the world. Lee-yeon, open the door. The lack of inflection in his voice made it 10 times more terrifying. If she could just see his eyes, perhaps she could gauge the threat, but this disembodied, deep whisper was psychological torture. An agonizing, heavy silence blanketed the hallway. Minutes ticked by like hours. Finally, the old wooden floorboards outside creaked, signaling his departure. Lee-yeon threw the blanket aside, her lungs finally expanding as she drew a desperate breath of relief. But then, a sickening thought halted her. A wife avoiding her husband. What conclusion will a killer draw from that? Driven by raw, uncontrollable anxiety, her body moved before her brain could stop it. She crept to the door, pressing her ear flat against the cold wood, listening for his retreating steps. The silence split open. Did you honestly think I left? His voice whispered, right against the other side of the wood. Lee-yeon staggered backward, her knees hitting the frame of her mattress as she scrambled to cover her mouth, choking back a desperate scream. Where are you going? His voice bled through the wood, dripping with an unnatural, focused calm. Come closer. Dropping her gaze, she saw the dark silhouettes of his feet reappearing through the gap at the bottom of the door. It was a sickening realization. He wasn't just standing there. He was tracking her shadow, measuring her fear by the movement of the light. The floorboard creak she had heard earlier hadn't been him walking away. It had been a trap to make her lower her guard. Come closer to the wood. Chae-woo rasped, his breath hot against the panel. I can't smell you. What? Did you forget? You smell like wet grass. Bam! The old wood groaned as he slammed his body against it. Lee-yeon recoiled, her heart leaping into her throat as the overhead bulb flickered violently. Her palms were slick with cold sweat, trapped inside a bedroom that now felt exactly like a slaughterhouse. I don't even know who I am without you. Chae-woo whispered, his forehead resting heavily against the shaking door. My limbs are attached, my lungs take in air, but I feel absolutely nothing. I cannot tell if I am alive or dead. A horrific, scratching sound filled the silence. The sound of his fingernails slowly dragging down the wood, scraping the paint like a beast trying to claw through dirt. He was deliberately psychological, playing with her sanity, twisting her into a knot of pure terror. So, tell me I'm not trapped in a nightmare. He thudded his head against the door again, harder this time. Tell me I haven't lost my mind. Tell me about my past. Anything. Give me a single detail. Just convince me that I actually existed before this blank space. Bam! His breathing grew ragged, heavy, and dangerous. Lee-yeon knew, with absolute certainty, that his restored muscles could splinter this rotting door into kindling within seconds. She stood paralyzed by the sheer monster she had unleashed. Kind, gentle, polite. Those were the desperate, ridiculous lies she had fed him to save her own skin. Looking at the violent shadow outside, she realized how thin her armor truly was. Yet, the lie was all she had. Kwon Chae-woo. She called out, her voice trembling but deliberate. The metallic doorknob instantly froze at her voice. She clasped her damp hands together, forcing her lungs to steady. I am not wearing anything right now because I was in the middle of a shower. She lied, praying his primal instincts would respect the boundary. My eyes are burning from the shampoo. Can we please talk later? This really isn't a good time. A sudden, absolute silence fell over the hallway. The frantic, violent rattling stopped instantly. In the blink of an eye, the beast receded, replacing itself with a chillingly polite husband. Okay. He murmured. The compliance was exactly what she wanted, yet the whiplash of his changing moods left her entirely cold. She rubbed her freezing arms, her chest heaving. Remember to keep the door locked. His voice drifted through, the absolute opposite of his behavior just seconds ago. Creak. The shadow beneath the door finally shifted, moving away from her sanctuary. Lee-yeon closed her eyes, letting her stiff, aching shoulders drop. But before she could fully exhale, his voice echoed from the base of the stairs. Just so you know, please do not come up to the second floor tonight. What? Why? I'm thinking of shaving my lower body. It's been a while. Lee-yeon blinked into the darkness, her mind struggling to process the bizarre turn. Somehow, through the thick wood, she could feel his dark, mocking smile. Then, Lee-yeon. I will see you later. He spoke with an eerie finality, like a man who knew he was about to depart. And he was right. Following that suffocating night, Kwon Chae-woo did not wake up again, slipping into a profound, unbroken coma that lasted for more than a week. A horrific nightmare shattered her rest. Lee-yeon sat up in the dark, drenched in cold sweat, her eyes out of focus from severe sleep deprivation. It took several long minutes for the fog in her brain to clear, and when it did, a heavy weight pressed down on her chest. Ah, it's today, that day. The calendar didn't lie, and before her feet even touched the cold floor, every ounce of energy was sucked from her bones. Director so. Chu-ja's voice cut through her daze. Lee-yeon stumbled out of her room, her vision blurring into dangerous streaks of light. Chu-ja caught her by the arm, steadying her trembling frame before pressing a maternal hand firmly against Lee-yeon's forehead. You're burning up. Are you having a fever? Chu-ja's face lined with genuine anxiety. Why is your life a non-stop war zone? Rest today. The clinic is dead. There's barely any work to do. Lee-yeon frowned, weakly pushing Chu-ja's comforting hands away as she forced herself to stand upright. She clenched her fists, trying to drive away the painful tingling in her fingers. The lack of work is exactly why I need to be moving. She muttered. I said no. Chu-ja barked, hands planting firmly on her waist. Stop being so damn stubborn. Take the day off. If you absolutely must look at something, go tend to your precious plants on the second floor. Lee-yeon ignored the advice, veering toward the bathroom. Dropping her hands under the cold faucet, she looked up, staring at her reflection in the stained mirror. The girl staring back was slender, pale, and exhausted. The dirty, neglected child with the matted hair from her past was long gone, buried under layers of time. Yet, in the nightmare she just escaped, that little girl was still there, writing the same phrase over and over again with small, bleeding fingers on a never-ending stack of paper. I was born wrong. I was born wrong. I was born wrong. A mountain of apology letters, taller than her childhood self, a punishment she had been forced to write in every spare hour of her life until she finally ran away from home at 17. The trauma was a ghost that refused to leave her. But Director So, there is one minor detail I forgot to ask. Chu-ja's voice drifted into the bathroom, breaking her dark reverie. What is it? Our heavy sleeping plant son-in-law up there. Chu-ja mused, her face twisting into a look of practical, dark humor. If he's been completely unconscious for over a week, how exactly is he emptying his bladder? The thick, clinical tension vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp burst of laughter. It was a reminder that today was supposed to be special, but for Lee-yeon, everything was entirely normal, because she had long since buried the memory of her own birthday beneath the dirt. When Chu-ja had first stepped onto the second floor, she hadn't looked like a friend. She had behaved like a meticulous real estate appraiser, taking in the polished wooden trim and the expensive, heavy furniture. Her eyes had practically left a bold checkmark next to a single mental box, obscurely, terrifyingly wealthy. I heard he actually gets up to use the washroom. Lee-yeon murmured, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. In his sleep. Chu-ja's eyebrows shot up, like some kind of nocturnal ghost. Yes. My goodness, what a bizarre creature. Lee-yeon didn't elaborate on the sheer horror of it. Once, she had wandered upstairs without thinking, only to find Chae-woo standing perfectly upright in the pitch-black hallway, a massive, unmoving silhouette that nearly caused her heart to fail. Look at how flawless his skin is. Chu-ja mused, her fingers reaching out toward the sleeping giant. Lee-yeon immediately snatched her arm, her grip tight. Don't, he might wake up. He won't. Chu-ja insisted, rolling her eyes. I already tried shaking his shoulder earlier. He's dead to the world. Even so. Lee-yeon retreated, her gaze averting from the mattress. The chaotic storm of the past few weeks was finally fading into a blurry, distant dream. Quiet had returned to the clinic. A fragile, beautiful piece. Looking down at the man who lay as still as a corpse, his features smoother and more serene than she had ever seen them, she offered a silent, desperate prayer. Please, just stay under. Please just sleep like this forever. By the way. Chu-ja spoke up, breaking the silence. Did you see the morning papers? The principal at our old elementary school is in absolute ruins. Rumor has it the entire playground has been turned into a barren wasteland because of that illegal construction project. Chu-ja stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing as she locked onto Lee-yeon's face. It wasn't you, was it? Lee-yeon instinctively scratched her cheek, her eyes flitting away. You actually reported him to the press. Chu-ja thundered. I mean, the root systems were. Are you actively trying to bankrupt us? Chu-ja yelled, her hands flying to her waist. Didn't I tell you our entire livelihood depends on managing client relationships? Do you even possess a functioning brain? Lee-yeon didn't answer. She simply turned and quietly slipped down the stairs. Chu-ja's muffled scolding echoed behind her, but she couldn't bring herself to care. A small, stubborn smile tugged at the corner of her lips. The principal wasn't the only culprit. The entire world treated trees as disposable ornaments, valued less than concrete. She knew she couldn't change the world, but she could fight her own quiet wars. Suddenly, a fierce, unnatural chill swept through the stairwell, making her shiver. See you later, Lee-yeon. His parting words from a week ago echoed in the dark. Chae-woo had been unconscious for 7 straight days. It was as if the monster had anticipated the exact consequence of her refusal to share his bed, and had chosen to lock himself away in the dark. This is absolute madness. Lee-yeon spat, the bitter, briny taste of contaminated soil lingering on her tongue. She shoved her straw hat into her bag, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury as she marched straight through the glass doors of the neighborhood seafood restaurant. "Sir. Welcome. Oh, it's you." The owner's face immediately darkened into a scowl. "Get out. Leave my establishment right now. Are you actively trying to slaughter them again? I have no idea what garbage you're spewing." The man growled, planting a heavy hand on her shoulder to steer her back toward the street. But Lee-yeon anchored her feet, her fingers locking onto the door frame with white-knuckled stubbornness. "Last time, you injected straight herbicide into the arbor ringer to kill the roots," she hissed, her voice vibrating with psychological tension. "If you keep harassing my patrons, I'm calling the police." This morning, it was seawater, wasn't it? She could still taste the sharp, mineral salt from the sample she had dug up. Inside, the dining room grew deathly quiet as customers began to murmur. The owner's neck turned a deep, furious crimson. This lunatic woman was systematically destroying his business. "I knew it was strange," she pressed, her eyes flashing. "The ginkgo tree outside has been withering for months. I never hired you. This isn't your property, and it's none of your damn business." With a rough, violent shove, the man launched Lee-yeon out onto the pavement, his eyes small, trembling, and completely transparent. To a woman who read the silent agony of nature, reading the guilt in a human being was ridiculously simple. "Your little tree hospital went completely bankrupt because you spend all your time snooping around other people's land." He spat onto the dirt. "Everyone in this village knows you're insane. You know that, right?" "I know." "Then stop doing it." The notoriety of Saw Lee-yeon, director of the Spruce Tree Hospital, had reached a fever pitch after the elementary school scandal. The locals were constantly fooled by her innocent, fragile face, completely blindsided by the sharp, uncompromising fanaticism hidden beneath. She didn't care about human convenience. She didn't care about their excuses. If a tree was screaming, she would rush to save it, even if the world called her mad. "Just shut your mouth and walk away," the owner rasped, crossing his arms. "It's my tree, on my plot of land. I have the legal right to do whatever I want with it. I don't need your clinic, and I don't need your pity. You are crossing the line." "Then who else is going to stand there?" Lee-yeon whispered. "What? If I don't help that ginkgo, who will?" She pointed a trembling finger at the dying, yellowed canopy. "I know exactly why you're doing it. The branches are obscuring your flashing neon signboard." The man's jaw tightened. "Every single morning, you spray it with salt water, you peel away the protective bark, you pour toxic waste oil directly into the soil. You inject poisons into the trunk and score the wood with a chainsaw." Her voice cracked, an emotional outburst she had suppressed since dawn finally tearing through her chest. "What happens to them if I stop caring? To your eyes, they are no different than a wooden telephone pole. But these are living, breathing things. Once they have anchored themselves into the earth, they have earned the right to live." The raw, suffocating injustice of it all dragged her back to that cold childhood room, back to the small, bleeding hand holding the pencil, writing page after page of apology letters until they piled higher than her own head. Used and thrown away, because they are inconvenient. The restaurant owner opened his mouth to bark another angry insult, but as he looked into her bloodshot, tear-filled eyes, the air suddenly left his lungs. "Do you want to hear something truly terrifying?" Lee-yeon whispered, her teeth clenching as she forced the tears back into her eyes. "Long after your body has rotted into dust, these trees will still be drawing breath. They will outlive you by centuries." The entire universe felt entirely off balance. The weight of a brutal day had left her hollow, drained of everything but a familiar, lingering ache. Lee-yeon sat curled on the sofa, her arms wrapped tightly around a heavy clay flower pot, pressing the cool, unjudging clay against her chest. It was her old ritual, seeking sanctuary in the silent, predictable world of roots and soil when the human world became too sharp to handle. Subconsciously, her gaze drifted toward the dark stairwell leading up to the second floor. A jolt of panic struck her, and she violently shook her head, trying to clear the static from her brain. What was she doing? Why was she looking up there? That monster had absolutely nothing to do with her. The past 7 days had been the exact definition of the peace she had spent her entire life running toward. Quiet, boring, and perfectly still. Yet, the human mind is a cruel machine. The longer Kwon Chae-woo remained locked in his deep, unbroken slumber, the more sleep-deprived Lee-yeon became. The absolute stillness of the clinic didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like the heavy, suffocating air right before a thunderstorm. She hated the reality of it. But for 2 long years, she had lived alongside a body that was essentially a plant. They had established a toxic, fragile equilibrium. Now, her paranoia had grown teeth. Every midnight, she found herself creeping up the stairs, driven by an obsessive need to verify that his coma was still intact, that the beast hadn't secretly opened his eyes. Stop it, just stop thinking, she whispered to herself, leaning forward until her nose was buried in the fragrant, sharp herbal leaves of the pot in her lap, inhaling the green scent to anchor her sanity. Suddenly, Lee-yeon stiffened, her chin jerking upward. What was that sound? It was faint, a fragile, low sound cutting through the midnight static. A cold dread coiled in her stomach. Alert and entirely breathless, her eyes locked onto the dark wooden steps. Her internal instinct screamed at her to stay down, to lock her bedroom door and pretend the world didn't exist. But a strange, psychological gravity pulled her forward. Her feet moved silently up the creaking wood, her fingers turning the knob of the shabby door. Inside, the bedside lamp cast a dim, amber glow across the sheet. Chae-woo lay there, his massive frame so entirely motionless he looked less like flesh and more like a marble statue carved by a twisted artist. But the sound was real. His lips parted slightly, a microscopic movement that made Lee-yeon's entire body freeze, from her ankles to her chest. But he wasn't waking up. The sound escaping his throat wasn't a growl of anger or a threat of violence. It was a soft, broken sob. The monster was weeping in his sleep. Thick, heavy drops of moisture spilled from the corners of his closed eyes, tracing down the sharp, elegant lines of his cheekbones. "No," he mumbled, his dry, cracked lips straining to give shape to the ghosts in his mind. "Go. Get out. Leave now." His handsome features twisted into a mask of pure, agonizing pain. Lee-yeon stared down at him, a bizarre, heavy contrast washing over her. A murderer having a nightmare. It was almost poetic. A twisted form of cosmic justice, a subconscious debt being paid for whatever blood he had spilled on that dark mountain. Watching his distress, a strange, dark relief lifted from her chest. If he was suffering, then perhaps the universe was fair after all. But then, his chest began to heave, his breaths catching in ragged, desperate gasps. "Hide me," he stammered, his voice cracking with a raw, childlike terror. "Forget, just forget." The fragments of his sentences made absolutely no sense to her. He looked completely defenseless, a man drowning in a past he couldn't even remember while awake. Chu-ja had called him glamorous, a high-born creature of wealth and power who could snap a spine without blinking. But right now, stripped of his memory and his conscious armor, he looked like nothing more than a terrified boy fleeing from an invisible executioner. "Live," he gasped, a suffocating breath tearing from his lungs. Against every ounce of her common sense, a sharp, unwanted pang of worry bloomed inside her. She made a move to turn away, to flee back to the safety of the first floor, but her eyes refused to leave his wet cheeks. Hesitantly, her hand rose, her fingertips hovering over his flushed, heated skin. The moment her flesh brushed his cheek, a sharp shock of static electricity zipped through her nerve endings. She flinched, pulling her hand back into her sleeve. "It seems you don't want to sleep, Kwon Chae-woo," she whispered into the dim light. "But I truly, desperately need you to stay under. Please." She had only ever known him as a corpse or a predator, cold, blank, or terrifyingly focused. Seeing him broken like this felt wrong, intimate in a way she wasn't prepared for. She frantically wiped her palms against her pajamas. "So you are human after all," she thought. "I really, really hoped you weren't. I won't feel guilty if you never wake up," she murmured, ruffling her unkempt hair with a weary sigh. "Maybe a little, but it's safer for everyone this way." To be honest, I feel more sympathy for the dying ginkgo trees on the street corner than I do for you. She pulled up the old wooden chair, sitting down tightly beside the mattress, resting her chin on her knees as she let her rambling thoughts drift aloud. Trees are clean, gentle, and predictable. You belong to the poisonous genus. Do you know how difficult it is to cultivate a carnivorous plant? They are terrifying creatures. She reached out again, her thumb gently catching another stray tear before it hit the pillow. Don't cry. A man like you should be wiping his own tears. I couldn't cry when I was little, she whispered, her voice dropping into a soft, yearning cadence. Because even when I did, the house was too loud, and no one ever listened. Only the trees, the flowers that bloomed and died in their seasons. They were the only ones who ever heard my story. They were my only friends. She leaned closer, her breath fanning over his ear, drawn into the psychological orbit of his nightmare. Today, I tasted the soil beneath a dying tree. It was entirely too salty. Nature shouldn't taste like grief. Are your tears the same way? She had a choice. She could leave him to drown in his invisible mud, or she could pull him back. She looked at his scrunched nose, his groans growing shallower, more frantic. You look exactly like that ginkgo tree at the restaurant today. She grumbled softly, poisoned from the roots up. Sometimes, the human mind consciously chooses the most dangerous path, fully aware of the cliff ahead, yet stepping off anyway. Lee-yeon ignored the mild, burning fever that had plagued her body since morning. She stopped fighting the fear. Consider this a birthday present, she mumbled, her voice thick with the unshed tears of a very bad day. Giving up her sanctuary, she crawled onto the mattress, lying down softly in the warmth beside the weeping monster. A sharp, sudden clarity shattered the void. Kwon Chae-woo blinked, instinctively raising a heavy hand to shield his eyes from the morning sun slicing through the window. But as his arm moved, the back of his hand collided with a soft, warm reality. He turned his head, his brow furrowing in absolute bewilderment. Lee-yeon was lying right beside him, her small hand still clinging desperately to his arm. In an instant, every muscle in Chae-woo's body turned to stone. The words he was about to speak evaporated from his throat. He felt violently, shockingly awake, as if a bucket of sub-zero Arctic water had been dumped directly over his head. He had a lingering, hazy recollection of a agonizing nightmare, a dark ocean of grief. But the entire illusion vanished the moment his eyes locked onto her sleeping face. Perhaps this man named Kwon Chae-woo was born an absolute fool. His complex, dangerous mind went completely blank at the microscopic touch of this woman. Saw Lee-yeon. My wife. A doctor who heals broken trees. A terrible accident. He stared down at the fragile creature breathing softly against his arm, sorting through the sparse fragments of information he possessed. None of it felt grand. None of it explained the sheer intensity of his tether to her. He clicked his tongue, a faint ripple of annoyance disturbing his features. He remembered the exact second his consciousness had returned to his body. Hers was the solitary face etched into the blank canvas of his mind. He could still recall the intoxicating, peculiar scent of wet grass and rich earth that tickled his senses whenever she breathed near him. Amnesia was a brutal, sickening blow. It left him with a constant undercurrent of nausea and frustration. In place of an entire lifetime, instead of family, friends, or a legacy, the universe had left him with exactly one anchor. Her. It was pure, animal instinct. It hadn't taken him long to surrender to it. Since her face was the only occupant of his empty head, he had accepted her as his absolute truth. But the more he observed, the more the puzzle of Lee-yeon refused to fit together. He remembered her defensive, trembling words from before. A wife you can't even remember suddenly appeared. I was worried about how uncomfortable it would be for you. But it was a lie. He could tell at a single glance exactly why she was his wife, and why she had to belong to him. He literally could not tear his eyes away from her. Yet, while her lips claimed the title of a devoted wife, her body betrayed a completely different story. Every single time he stepped into her personal space, she vibrated with an untamable, primitive fear. Her pale fingers bore no ghostly indentations of a wedding band. Her walls were entirely barren of their shared history, No photographs, no memories. There was never a flicker of warmth when he moved, only a sharp, defensive flinch. Sometimes, a dark desire rose within him to gently take her chin between his fingers, force her terrified eyes to meet his, and demand the truth. You are my entire universe. So why do you look at me like I am your executioner? Why did you nurse my broken body back to life if you only intended to dread my touch? Good morning. Lee-yeon murmured, her eyelids fluttering open as she rubbed the sleep from her face. Chae-woo remained perfectly still, propping his chin in his palm, his intense, dark gaze boring into her without a word. Slowly, the soft lines of Lee-yeon's face began to harden into a mask of pure, vigilant caution. She was immediately on her guard, reading his expression like a high-stakes map. Chae-woo could practically hear the frantic, rhythmic hammering of her heart against her ribs. He lifted a single, mocking eyebrow, tracking her panic. Was the original Kwon Chae-woo truly the kind, gentle savior she claimed? Lee-yeon, have you been doing well? He asked, his voice dropping into a smooth, deceptively soft cadence. Yes. She stammered. I've been feeling incredibly under the weather. He mused, his eyes never leaving hers. How long was I asleep? At the gentle, harmless tone of his voice, Lee-yeon's tense shoulders slowly dropped in visible relief. A week and a day. He tilted his head, stretching the unnatural stiffness from his neck until a sharp, loud crack echoed through the quiet bedroom. Now I know for certain. Know what? That you hold my mornings. Medical science and professional diagnoses meant absolutely nothing to a man like him. He didn't need a doctor to tell him his condition. When Lee-yeon slept by his side, his mind was peaceful, his body woke normally. Without her, he was a prisoner trapped in an eternal, suffocating dark. And because of that, he whispered, his voice turning sharp, heavy, and undeniably sensual, I intend to leave my nights to you as well. Lee-yeon winced, her entire countenance freezing over. She tried desperately to mask the sheer terror clawing at her throat, but her mind was transparent to him. He watched her force a fragile, tragic little smile, and it brought a wave of profound, dark sadness to his chest. She had no idea he could read her soul. Perhaps Lee-yeon had been calculating the perfect moment to vanish into the night, to escape him entirely, just like that bedroom door down the hall that remained resolutely locked no matter how violently he rattled the handle. But he didn't know the full story yet. It was a secret he would have to tear from her piece by piece. One thing, however, was absolute: he would never let her go. What kind of absolute idiot would abandon the solitary memory keeping him anchored to reality? She was everything, and Kwon Chae-woo was fully prepared to morph into whatever creature she required. He would play the part of the kind and gentle husband she desperately wished for. If that was the price of her comfort, he would pay it. He would fashion a beautiful, comfortable cage for her, until she finally confessed the sins of their past. Lee-yeon plotting her escape, and Kwon Chae-woo ensuring she stayed rooted forever. It was a silent, psychological war, and neither of them knew who would break first. Lee-yeon, from this day forward, you sleep in my bed. She instantly averted her eyes, completely unable to hold his piercing stare. As Chae-woo lowered his gaze, his eyes caught the damp, tear-soaked fabric of her sleeve. Now he understood why his own eyes stung with the phantom sensation of salt. A sudden, overwhelming warmth bloomed deep inside his chest. He raised his large hands, covering his face entirely, desperately trying to conceal the dark, victorious smile spreading across his lips. The transition was complete and entirely unsettling. Lee-yeon stood in the dim corridor, her eyes scanning the man standing before her. Gone was the wild, matted hair that had overgrown during his 2-year slumber. It was neatly shorn now, the bangs falling softly across his forehead to frame a face that was, frankly, devastatingly striking. In his clean, tailored slacks and a simple round t-shirt, he possessed the effortless, innocent charm of a university student. He looked toward her, catching the morning light, looking every bit the loyal, devoted protector. Yet, the human mind is a treacherous thing. Beneath the sunny facade, Lee-yeon's memory flashed with a darker, slicker image, a glistening, dark raincoat cutting through a mountain storm. The jarring contrast made her stomach turn. Kwon Chae-woo, Wouldn't it be far better for you to just rest inside today? She murmured, her voice tight. Are you worried I might cause trouble? He asked, his tone deceptively smooth. No, it's not that at all. She lied quickly, pulling the brim of her worn straw hat lower to shield her face. This domestic transformation was entirely Chu Ja's doing. Chu Ja had grown tired of the clinical gowns and had marched out to buy him a new wardrobe, giving him a fresh lease on life. Watching him, Lee-yeon felt a bitter, dark humor wash over her. She felt exactly like the desperate woodcutter from the old fairy tales, the one who hides the fairies' winged clothes out of an intense, suffocating fear that they will fly away the moment they remember the sky. She could not let him step outside the perimeter of this clinic. Her fragile tower of lies depended entirely on his isolation. If he mingled with the world, the truth would bleed out, and she would be forced to invent 100 new deceptions just to bury the original. The guilt alone was already shortening her lifespan. Lee-yeon, are you seriously marching out into the world looking like that? Chu Ja stepped into the room, her eyes full of judgment as she took in Lee-yeon's uniform. White sneakers permanently stained with dark loam, an oversized, boxy grey suit, and a frayed straw hat. Where on earth is our hospital's pride? Right here. Lee-yeon countered softly, tapping the worn leather file containing her precise treatment logs. She might look like a stray, and her clinic might be crumbling, but her competence was absolute. Not a single tree had ever died under her watch. That was her solitary, fierce pride. Which is exactly why you need to take him along. Chu Ja whispered, nudging her shoulder and casting a lingering glance at the giant behind them. Think of him as the new public face of our establishment. When the wealthy ladies see a specimen like this standing beside you, they'll think flowers will bloom just by looking at him. Our business will double by sunset. What are you even talking about? Lee-yeon's cheeks flushed a violent, involuntary crimson. She awkwardly began adjusting her oversized lapels, trying to swallow her panic. Today was the critical bidding session for the beautiful Hwaido project, a massive environmental initiative backed by the City Park Office and the Forest Service. Every major official would be packed into that room. Taking a deep breath, Lee-yeon anchored her hands on her waist. She stared hard at the floorboards, before finally forcing her gaze up to meet his intense, dark eyes. It's dangerous outside, she said, the warning heavy and deliberate. Chu Ja scoffed, throwing her hands up in disbelief. Particularly for you, Chae-woo. Lee-yeon pressed. Why? Because a single, sharp external stimulus could shatter his amnesia and bring the predator back to life. She obviously couldn't say that aloud. Chae-woo stood perfectly still, his quiet, calculating gaze waiting for her to construct a rational defense. Lee-yeon, are you hiding something from me? He asked suddenly, the question landing with a soft, psychological weight. No, she blurted out, entirely too fast. A microcrack had formed in her armor, and she needed to seal it instantly before he dug deeper. It's because you're entirely too handsome, she gasped, the absurd excuse flying from her lips before she could filter it. The place I'm going is crawling with powerful, fragile old men. A kind, young man like you has no idea how terrifying the jealousy of an old politician can be. She practically wiped the nervous sweat from her brow, feeling like she had just defused a bomb. Am I so beautiful that you feel the need to hide me away? Chu Ja giggled in the background. What? Chae-woo reached up, his fingers idly tracing his own earlobe, his expression unreadable, an emotional contrast of a smirk and a frown. He tugged at the skin until it burned a faint, localized red. Am I beautiful in your eyes, wife? Lee-yeon's tongue felt like lead. Flustered and trapped, she tried to steer the conversation into a vague, safe harbor. I simply prefer you to remain within the house. Because you don't want any other eyes on me. Every step backward only trapped her deeper in his snare. She shot a desperate, pleading look toward Chu Ja, but her friend was entirely content to watch her squirm, enjoying the entertainment from a safe distance. She had no choice. She had to appease the beast, to use the only weapon she had to keep him anchored to the floorboards. We are newlyweds, she stammered, her voice dropping to a fragile, yearning whisper. Given that your timeline was entirely shattered by that terrible accident, we are still in our honeymoon phase. So, naturally, I want to be the only soul who looks at you." A soft, victorious smile bloomed across Chae-woo's lips, the answer hitting his ego exactly where he wanted. "Then, you shouldn't go out either," he murmured softly. "What?" "Because I find myself entirely incapable of being separated from you, even for a single minute." He leaned closer, his gaze turning tenacious, burning with a quiet, passionate intensity that belied his gentle words. "I will be perfectly silent. Just think of me as your favorite flower pot, and carry me along with you." Lee-yeon fought the urge to flinch away from that sharp, unyielding stare. If she refused him now, his paranoia would ignite. He would realize she wasn't protecting a patient. She was isolating a prisoner. Desperate, she tried to soften her tone, pouring honey over her words to soothe his stubbornness. "Are you certain? You are still recovering. I know your healing rate is miraculous, but the venue will be chaotic, loud, and entirely complicated for someone without their memories." Her soft, pale cheeks moved beautifully as she spoke, looking so fragile under his intense gaze, completely unaware of the dark, possessive trap tightening around her with every syllable.